Squadron leader Roy Raymond eased the throttles of his Gloster Javelin FAW.7 forward at RAF Luchas on a wet morning in March 1959, watching the Sapphire turbojets spool towards 11,000 pounds of thrust apiece. On the concrete beside him, a US Air Force liaison officer from the 32nd Fighter Interceptor Squadron at Soesterberg stood with his hands in his pockets, skeptical. The Americans had come to observe. They had heard from their colleagues at Manston and Bentwaters that the RAF's new Delta was slow off the mark, ungainly on the runway, an aircraft that looked, as one F-100 pilot put it in a letter now held at the Imperial War Museum, like a flat iron with a broken back. What the visitors did not yet appreciate was that the Javelin had not been built to dogfight American Super Sabres in clear Mediterranean skies. It had been built for the specific, unglamorous and terrifying task of climbing into the North Sea, overcast at 3 a.m, to intercept Soviet Tupolev Tu-16 Badgers approaching the United Kingdom air defense region. The Air Ministry had begun the Javelin program in 1947, when Attlee's government still assumed that the next war would be fought within a decade, and that it would come, as the previous one had, out of the cloud. Specification F.44/46 demanded an all-weather two-seat fighter capable of engaging bombers at 40,000 feet in zero visibility. Gloster's chief designer, Richard Walker, produced the world's first twin-engined, delta-winged fighter. It first flew on November 26, 1951 from Moreton Valence, and by 1956 it was entering service with No. 46 Squadron at RAF Odiham. By the spring of 1959, Fighter Command had 9 operational Javelin squadrons, and Air Marshal Sir Thomas Pike, the Commander-in-Chief, was pressing the Ministry of Defence for a 10th. The Americans did not fully grasp what the aircraft was for. USAF Europe, still shaped by the daylight fighter culture of the Korean War, thought in terms of turning circles and gun kills. The Royal Air Force, having spent the late 1940s reading Bomber Command's own after-action reports on how vulnerable a night-flying force could be, thought in terms of radar contacts, ground-controlled interception vectors, and a single de Havilland Firestreak infrared missile launched in cloud at a target the pilot would never see with his eyes. That divergence in doctrine was the point of the exercise scheduled for that week. The Central Fighter Establishment at RAF West Raynham had proposed a series of comparative interception trials against USAF F-100D Super Sabres detached from the 20th Tactical Fighter Wing at Wethersfield in Essex. The Americans had accepted with what the RAF liaison at Bentwaters described, in a memorandum now catalogued at the National Archives at Kew as AIR 20/10896, as considerable confidence. The trials were to run under GCY control from the radar station at RAF Bulmer at night, in weather no fair weather fighter pilot would voluntarily accept. Raymond released the brakes. The Javelin, all 17 tons of it, rolled forward with the peculiar bellow that ground crews at Luchas called the Gloster grumble, lifted off after 900 yards and vanished into cloud at 400 feet. The American observer looked at his watch. The exercise had begun. Whitehall's interest in the trials went considerably deeper than squadron rivalry. The Air Staff under Air Chief Marshal Sir Dermot Boyle had been fighting a 2-year battle with the Treasury and with Duncan Sandys, the Minister of Defence, over the future shape of British air power. Sandys had published his Defence White Paper on April 4, 1957, and its central assertion that manned fighters were approaching obsolescence and that surface-to-air missiles would inherit their role, had landed on Fighter Command like a bomb. Bloodhound Mark I missile sites were already being constructed at North Coats and Marham. The Javelin was, in official documents, the last manned all-weather fighter to enter Royal Air Force service. Everyone in Adastral House understood what that phrase meant. The trials at Luchas therefore carried a political weight out of proportion to their tactical content. If the Javelin could demonstrate, under realistic North Atlantic conditions, that a manned interceptor still offered capabilities that no missile system could match. The air staff might yet preserve a follow-on fighter program. The English Electric Lightning, then in the final stages of development at Wharton, would be the beneficiary. Boyle wanted evidence he could put in front of Harold Macmillan. Group Captain Peter Wykeham, commanding the Central Fighter Establishment, drafted the trial protocols in January 1959. He specified 4 scenarios: high-altitude interception in cloud, low-level penetration by simulated IL-28 Beagles across the North Sea, night interception of a stream raid, and combat maneuvering at 25,000 feet against the F-100D. Only the last of these favored the American aircraft. The other 3 tested the disciplines the RAF had built its air defense around since 1946: ground control, airborne interception radar, and the AI.17 set that gave the Javelin's navigator a scope reach of some 20 nautical miles. The Americans arrived at Luchas on March 9th. The 20th TFW detachment was led by Lieutenant Colonel Richard Boyd, a Korean War ace with 6 MiG-15 to his credit. He brought 6 F-100Ds, 10 pilots, and a ground team that included 2 radar technicians whose brief, quietly stated to the RAF liaison, was to assess the AI.17 for possible USAF interest. The RAF hosted them at the officers' mess, provided them with the standard briefing on Scottish weather, and warned them that in March the sea fog off the Tay could reduce visibility to under 400 yards within 10 minutes. Boyd was polite about the warning. His pilots, most of them under 30, were less so. One of them, Captain Charles Ellsworth, later interviewed by Air Clues magazine, admitted that on the flight up from Wethersfield, he had privately concluded that the Javelin was a museum piece with radar. Ellsworth would fly against squadron leader Raymond on the 3rd day of the trial. The exercise directive, signed by Wykeham on March 11th, ran to 14 pages. It specified that all engagements would be flown under strict GCI control from Bulmer, that no maneuver below 5,000 feet would be permitted, and that the Firestreak missile shots would be simulated using cine-camera film synchronized to the aircraft's radar lock. Boyd countersigned it. The first sortie was scheduled for the following morning at 0400 hours, in weather the Meteorological Office at Dunstable was already forecasting as, in the language of RAF pilots, clag to the deck. Raymond's navigator that morning was Flying Officer Michael Wilson, 24 years old, 6 months out of the AI course at RAF Bordsey. Wilson had trained on the American APQ-43 during a NATO exchange at Otis Air Force Base the previous summer, which meant he understood in a way that few of his colleagues did precisely what the AI.17 could do that its American counterparts could not. The Echo-designed set had a wider scan angle, better low-altitude clutter rejection, and a lock-on range against a Canberra-sized target of some 16 miles. What it lacked was the raw power output of the newer American sets. Wilson had learned to compensate by working closer to the ground controller, treating the GCI vector not as a rough steer, but as the first half of the intercept solution. The trial began at 0412 hours on March 12th. 2 Javelins from No. 151 Squadron, Raymond leading, were vectored by Bulmer against 2 F-100Ds acting as target aircraft over the North Sea, 60 miles east of Aberdeen. The cloud base was 200 feet, tops at 28,000. The Americans were briefed to fly a straight-line penetration at Mach 0.85 and 20,000 feet, simulating a Badger's cruise profile. They did not know when or from where the interception would come. Wilson picked up the leading F-100D on his scope at 14 miles. The target was tracking 190 degrees, indicated airspeed 530 knots. Raymond initiated a port turn to bring the Javelin onto a converging heading, throttled back to hold 900 pounds of fuel flow, and let Wilson call the geometry. At 6 miles, Wilson achieved a lock-on. At 3 miles, the Firestreak seeker head, hunting for the F-100's tailpipe, would have acquired. At 2 miles, in the dry procedural language of the AI trade, Wilson called Judy, the signal that the navigator had taken control of the intercept and no further GCY vectors were required. Raymond fired the simulated missile at 1.8 miles. The cinefilm developed at Luchars that afternoon showed the F-100D's exhaust plume centered in the reticle for 4 consecutive frames. Boyd's pilots had never seen the interception coming. On the second sortie an hour later, when the roles were reversed and the F-100Ds were vectored against Javelins over the same sector, the Americans failed to achieve a single successful attack. Their AN/APG-30 gun-ranging radar was designed for close-in gunnery, not for the 15-mile geometry of an all-weather intercept. Boyd's own aircraft, flown against Raymond's wingman, Flight Lieutenant John Cartwright, ended the sortie 4 miles behind the Javelin at the same altitude, having lost visual contact in cloud within the first 90 seconds. On the ground at Luchars afterwards, Boyd was, by all accounts, quiet. Ellsworth was not. He walked into the debriefing room, took off his flying helmet, and asked Wykeham directly how the Javelin had achieved the intercept. Wykeham let Wilson answer. Wilson, who had been up for 11 hours, explained the AI.17 sequence in careful, unemotional detail. Ellsworth listened. When Wilson finished, Ellsworth said only, "We don't train for this." The exchange, noted verbatim by the RAF liaison officer, would appear in the trial report submitted to the Air Ministry on April 3, 1959. The report, catalogued at Q as AIR 20/10897, ran to 46 pages plus appendices. Wykeham's conclusions were carefully worded. The Javelin FAW.7 had demonstrated, under conditions representative of the North Atlantic operating environment, a night and all-weather interception capability substantially superior to that of the F-100D Super Sabre. In 11 of 14 scored engagements flown in cloud or at night, the Javelin had achieved a successful simulated missile launch. The F-100D in the same scenarios had achieved 2. In daylight combat maneuvering at 25,000 feet, the Super Sabre had won every engagement, its lighter wing loading and superior thrust-to-weight ratio giving it a decisive turning advantage. Wykeham was scrupulous about recording this. The air staff, he wrote, should not draw from the trials any conclusion that the Javelin was an air superiority fighter. It was not. It was, however, the most capable all-weather interceptor currently in NATO service in the European theatre. Boyle took the report to Sandys on April 14th. The meeting, recorded in the Cabinet Defence Committee minutes as DEF 5923, was brief and, by the standards of the period, unusually direct. Boyle argued that the trial results demonstrated the continuing operational value of the manned interceptor and provided empirical justification for accelerating the Lightning program. Sandys, who had staked considerable political capital on the missile-centric doctrine of the 1957 White Paper, was resistant. He pointed out that the trials had been conducted against an American day fighter, not against a modern Soviet bomber, and that the relevant question was whether the Javelin could intercept a Tu-95 Bear at high altitude in the 1960s. Boyle conceded the point, but noted that the AI.17 and Firestreak combination had performed to specification against every target it had been fielded against, and that no evidence existed that Soviet bombers would prove markedly harder targets than the F-100D. The exchange, Sir Frank Cooper later recalled in his oral history for the Imperial War Museum, was characteristic of the period. The RAF was fighting for its future in a Ministry of Defence that had already decided the future belonged to missiles. What the Luchars trials achieved in the end was a modest but real shift in the internal balance. Sandys did not reverse the White Paper. He did, however, sign off on the deployment of Firestreak armed Javelins to RAF Germany to reinforce the 2nd Tactical Air Force at Geilenkirchen and Bruggen, and he authorized the continuation of the Lightning program to full operational capability. The Americans took their own lessons from the trial. Boyd's report to USAF-E headquarters at Wiesbaden declassified in the mid-1990s and now held at the US Air Force Historical Research Agency at Maxwell, recommended that the F-100D be withdrawn from the air defense role in Europe, and that USAFE acquire a purpose-built all-weather interceptor. The recommendation was accepted. By the end of 1961, F-102 Delta Daggers were operating from Soesterberg, Bitburg and Ramstein. The 32nd Fighter Interceptor Squadron, which had sent the skeptical liaison officer to Luchars in March 1959, converted to the F-102 in July 1960. Ellsworth flew the F-102 for the remainder of his European tour. He never publicly discussed the Javelin trials again, but in a letter to his former squadron commander written in 1978 and quoted in Anthony Thornborough's History of Cold War NATO Air Defense, he acknowledged that the Brits had solved the night interception problem 5 years before we did, and they had done it with an aircraft we had laughed at. The Javelin's peak year was 1959. That summer, 14 operational squadrons flew the aircraft, split between Fighter Command in the United Kingdom, 2nd Tactical Air Force in West Germany, the Far East Air Force at RAF Tengar in Singapore, and Middle East Command in Cyprus and Aden. It was, in numerical terms, the most widely deployed British-built fighter of the jet age. It was also, in a way that few outside the air staff appreciated, the physical embodiment of a specific strategic doctrine. That Britain, though no longer able to sustain a wartime air force of Bomber Command's Second World War scale, could still credibly defend her own airspace and contribute a professional expeditionary component to NATO's forward defense in Central Europe. The Soviet threat that the Javelin had been designed to counter was, by 1959, evolving. The Tupolev Tu-16 Badger, which had entered service with long-range aviation in 1954, had been the reference target for the Javelin's specification. By the late 1950s, the Soviets were bringing the Tu-95 Bear and the M4 Bison into service, aircraft with substantially greater range and, in the Bear's case, the ability to loiter over the Norwegian Sea for extended periods. The Joint Intelligence Committee's assessment of Soviet long-range aviation, circulated to the Cabinet as JIC 5941 on July 22, 1959, estimated that the Soviet Union could put approximately 180 long-range bombers over the United Kingdom in a first strike, of which perhaps 60 would be armed with thermonuclear weapons. The Javelin was expected to intercept those bombers. The mathematics of the task, worked out by the Operational Research Branch at Fighter Command in a study delivered in October 1959, was uncomfortable. Fighter Command estimated that with 14 squadrons at readiness, and assuming a warning time of 20 minutes from the Fylingdales radar chain, then still under construction, the Javelin force could engage approximately 40% of the incoming raid before it reached weapon release. The remaining 60% would penetrate to their targets. The report was classified top secret and circulated to a distribution list of 11 names. That figure, 40%, shaped everything that followed. It justified the Bloodhound missile deployments. It justified the acceleration of the Lightning program. It justified in a way that the air staff would not publicly discuss until the archives opened in the 1990s. The shift of the deterrent role from Bomber Command's V-Force towards the submarine-based Polaris system that Macmillan negotiated with President Kennedy at Nassau in December 1962. The Javelin, in other words, was doing its job while simultaneously demonstrating that its job could not, in the terms of the mission as it had been originally conceived, actually be completed. Fighter Command's air defense of the United Kingdom against a determined Soviet nuclear strike was a delaying action, not a shield. Air Marshal Sir Hector Macgregor, who succeeded Pike at Fighter Command in July 1959, understood this. So did the Joint Planning Staff at the Ministry of Defence. So, by the summer of 1960, did Harold Watkinson, who had replaced Sandys as Minister of Defence in October 1959. The strategic logic drove the deployment pattern. Javelin squadrons in Germany were the ones expected to see combat in a European war. Those in the United Kingdom were, in a sense, buying time. Those in the Far East and Middle East were engaged in a different Cold War altogether. In December 1962, number 60 squadrons Javelins at Tengah would be scrambled against Indonesian Air Force incursions during the Konfrontasi. In April 1963, Javelins of No. 29 Squadron at Nicosia would intercept and escort out of Cypriot airspace 3 unidentified aircraft that were later assessed by JIC as Egyptian IL-28s, conducting reconnaissance of British sovereign base areas. The aircraft that the Americans had laughed at in March 1959 was, by the early 1960s, the most used interceptor in the British service. Its replacement was already flying. The English Electric Lightning F1 entered service with No. 74 Squadron at RAF Coltishall on June 29, 1960. It could climb to 50,000 feet in under 3 minutes. It could achieve Mach 2. It carried the same Firestreak missile as the Javelin, but coupled to an AI.23 radar with substantially greater range and a fire control system designed from the outset for supersonic interception. Wing Commander John Howe, the first CO of 74 Squadron, told a Ministry of Defense briefing in September 1960 that the Lightning represented a step change in British air defense capability of an order not seen since the hurricane. He was not exaggerating. The Javelin's decline began the moment the Lightning entered service. It was steady rather than dramatic. The squadrons in fighter command converted first, 74 Squadron in 1960, then 56 and 111 at Wattisham in 1961, then 226 Operational Conversion Unit at Middleton St. George. By 1964, all United Kingdom-based Javelin squadrons had either converted to the Lightning or disbanded. The Germany-based squadrons followed more slowly between 1964 and 1966. The Far East squadrons held on longest, partly because Konfrontasi kept them operationally engaged and partly because the logistics of maintaining Lightning squadrons at Tengah and Butterworth were formidable. The last operational Javelin sortie was flown by number 60 Squadron from RAF Tengah on April 30th, 1968. The aircraft XH-961 was flown home to the United Kingdom via the reinforcement route through Gan, Muharraq and Akrotiri, arriving at RAF St. Athan on May 15th. The squadron disbanded formally on April 30th, 1968. Group Captain David Roberts, who had commanded 60 Squadron during its final year, wrote in the squadron's operational record book, now held at the National Archives under AIR 27/3245, that the Javelin had given faithful service in a role that has grown steadily less recognized and now leaves the stage without ceremony or complaint. The retirement was quiet because the strategic environment had changed. By 1968, the Soviet manned bomber threat that had defined Fighter Command's mission since 1946 was receding. Soviet long-range aviation had shifted its emphasis to standoff missiles carried by Tu-16 and Tu-95 variants, and the primary Soviet strategic nuclear delivery system had become the intercontinental ballistic missile. The RAF's own strategic deterrent had passed from the V-Force to the Royal Navy's Polaris submarines, the first of which HMS Resolution had commissioned in October 1967. Air defense was no longer the war-winning discipline it had been in 1940. It was, by the late 1960s, a matter of maintaining sovereignty over British airspace against reconnaissance and probing intrusions, a task the Lightning could perform more effectively than the Javelin ever had, none of which diminished what the Javelin had actually accomplished. Between 1956 and 1968, it had stood the night watch over the United Kingdom during the most dangerous years of the Cold War. It had flown intercepts against Soviet bears over the North Sea, some of them documented in Fighter Command's records, and some of them, by the nature of the trade, not documented at all. It had operated in 3 theatres simultaneously. It had proved in the Lochars trials of March 1959 that a properly integrated air defense system, aircraft, radar, ground control, missile, crew training, doctrine, could do things that no single component of that system could do alone. Peter Hennessy, writing in his History of Britain in the Cold War, characterized the Javelin as the most instructive aircraft in the RAF's post-war inventory, precisely because it was never glamorous. The instruction was in the integration. The lesson was that British air defence from 1945 onwards was never about the aircraft alone. The Luchars trials had a second life in the historical record that neither Wykeham nor Boyle had anticipated. In 1988, when the Ministry of Defence began releasing files from the late 1950s under the 30-year rule, historians working at the Public Record Office at Kew came across the trial reports, the exchange between Boyle and Sandys, and the detailed engagement narratives that Wilson and his fellow navigators had written up in longhand at Luchars in March 1959. The material had been catalogued but not published. It emerged in the late 1980s and early 1990s into a historiography that had until then treated the Javelin as an unsuccessful transitional aircraft, an awkward predecessor to the Lightning. The revised assessment, led by Ken Delve at the RAF Museum at Hendon and by the aviation historian Robert Jackson, drew heavily on the AIR 20 series files. Delve's argument, made in a paper delivered to the Royal Aeronautical Society in 1993, was that the Javelin had been the first aircraft anywhere in NATO to demonstrate in realistic operational trials a genuine all-weather day and night interception capability. The Americans had reached the same capability with the F-102 by 1961, but they had done so partly by studying the British approach. Christopher Andrew, in his Authorized History of the Security Service published in 2009, made a related point about the strategic intelligence context. MI5's own assessment of the Soviet threat in the late 1950s, drawing on the Venona decrypts and on the debriefings of the Petrov defectors from the Australian Residency, had concluded that Soviet strategic bomber operations against the United Kingdom would be preceded by a period of increased reconnaissance activity that would provide warning at the political level. That warning, Andrew argued, was what the British air defence system had been designed around. The Javelin's job was to be ready when the warning came. It was in that sense an aircraft that had done its job by not having to fight the war it had been built for. The Lightning succeeded it and became the more famous aircraft. The Lightning's climb rate, its Mach 2 dash, its silhouette against a Cambridgeshire sky in the 1960s. These entered the visual culture of the Cold War in a way that the Javelin's slow, methodical intercepts at night in cloud never did. But when the Falklands crisis erupted in April 1982, and the Royal Navy's Sea Harrier pilots were required to conduct all-weather intercepts of Argentine Mirages over the South Atlantic using Blue Fox radar and AIM-9L sidewinders. The doctrine they applied, the tight GCI control, the navigator-led geometry, the emphasis on the first missile shot in poor visibility, was recognizably the doctrine that the Central Fighter establishment had developed with the Javelin in the late 1950s. Admiral Sir John Fieldhouse, commanding the Falklands Task Force, was briefed on the air defence problem by Rear Admiral Sandy Woodward before the fleet sailed south. The briefing notes, released to the National Archives in 2012, drew explicitly on the fighter command interception doctrine of the 1950s and 1960s. The Sea Harrier crews trained to the same standards that the Javelin navigators had been held to. The success rate they achieved over the Falklands, 23 confirmed kills for no air-to-air losses, was a validation of a lineage of British air defence practice that ran directly back to the trials at Luchars in March 1959. Ellsworth, by then a retired brigadier general living in San Antonio, was interviewed by the BBC for a documentary on the Falklands Air War broadcast in 1983. Asked how the Royal Navy had achieved such a favourable exchange ratio, he answered without hesitation. "They had been training for that fight," he said, "since I flew against a Gloster Javelin over Scotland in 1959. The final Javelin airframe in flying condition, XH-897, made its last flight on January 24, 1975, from A and AEE Boscombe Down to RAF Duxford, where it now sits in the Imperial War Museum's collection. The aircraft had been used as a trials machine by the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Bedford throughout the late 1960s, fitted with instrumentation packs for high-altitude atmospheric research. The pilot for the final flight was Squadron leader Wilf Hardy, who had served on 46 Squadron in 1957 as one of the first Javelin operational pilots. Hardy landed at Duxford, taxied to dispersal, shut down the engines and, according to the entry in his logbook now held at the RAF Museum, wrote only, "Last of the line. Well flown, old girl." The strategic context in which the Javelin had operated ended formally on December 25, 1991, when the flag of the Soviet Union was lowered over the Kremlin for the last time. The intervening years had brought the deployment of Tornado F-3 interceptors to replace the Lightning, the establishment of a permanent quick reaction alert commitment at Luchars and Coningsby that continues to the present day, and the steady drawdown of the Cold War air defense infrastructure that had been built up between 1946 and 1965. Fylingdale still watches for ballistic missiles. Bulmer still controls intercepts. The doctrine still holds. What the Javelin story shows when it is looked at closely is how the British approach to national defence during the Cold War worked in practice. It was not glamorous, it was not, for the most part, publicly celebrated. It was built around specific decisions taken in specific rooms. The Air Council chamber at Adastral House, the Cabinet Defence Committee, the Joint Intelligence Committee's Wednesday morning meetings in the Cabinet Office, by men who understood that the country they were defending had been substantially weakened by the war it had just fought, and that the country it was defending against was substantially more powerful than it had any wish to acknowledge. They built a defence anyway. They built it with the resources they had, in the aircraft their factories could produce, with the doctrine their operational experience allowed them to develop. The Luchars trials of March 1959 were a small episode in that larger story. 17 sorties over 5 days by aircraft from 2 air forces, watched by a handful of officers at a Scottish airfield. But the trials mattered in retrospect because they demonstrated something that neither the Americans nor the British had entirely understood before they took place, that the RAF in the 15 years since 1945 had developed a doctrine of integrated air defence that was, in its own carefully defined terms, the most sophisticated in the Western Alliance. The Javelin was the aircraft that had made that doctrine visible. By the time Squadron leader Raymond retired from the Royal Air Force in 1974, the aircraft he had flown at Luchars 15 years earlier was already in museums. By the time Captain Ellsworth gave his BBC interview in 1983, the doctrine that the Javelin had embodied had been transferred, tested and validated in combat over the South Atlantic. By the time the Cold War ended in 1991, the whole apparatus of British air defence had been rebuilt around new aircraft, new radars and new missiles, but around essentially the same operational principles. The National Archives file AIR 20/10897 was declassified in 1989. It sits today on a shelf at Kew. It is 32 pages of typewritten prose describing 17 intercepts flown in cloud over the North Sea in March 1959. It is one of the more instructive documents in the history of British air power. Most people who work on the Cold War have never read it. The pilots who flew the sorties it describes are almost all dead. The aircraft they flew is in a museum. The country they defended is still here.